What is up, you guys, and welcome back. Thanks for being here with me today. Today, I'm talking all about how the wounds of our parents may still be impacting us today. And just as a disclaimer, I thought that this was a heavy episode to record. It may be a heavy episode to listen to. So if you're in a place, a physical location where you're not able to digest, or it might get a little heavy for you, just keep that in mind. I just wanted to let you know that. I also wanted to say that in this episode, I used the word toxic parental patterns. And as I was editing this episode, I really realized that toxic really wasn't the word that I wanted to use. Toxic almost implies judgment on my part and malicious intent on theirs, and that's not my intention at all. And so if I were to go back and re-record this episode, I would have said something like, the unconscious parental patterns that were formed from your parents' own wound and how that impacted you. Do you see the difference? So I just wanted to highlight that and kind of bring that to clarification. It's important to recognize that hurt people most of the time unconscious. And even if it is conscious, there are unconscious pieces that sort of make it acceptable in the eyes of the person who's doing that. Likely nobody is intending to hurt other people. And so by having that mindset of it was unintentional, oftentimes that can lead to more progress in your own healing versus assuming that somebody's intentions were malicious or bad. So with that said, this episode covers 4 wounding patterns that may have been passed on to you, 4 parental types that may encompass some kind of wounding from when your parents were young and then had been passed on to you, and then also ways in which you may still be carrying that forward. So I intended to do this episode because I feel like it's a really important thing for us to talk about, even though it's not so easy. And the benefits, if we can look at this, are enormous. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode, and without further ado, welcome to the Get Out of Your Head podcast, where we talk all about the stories that keep you stuck, blocked from manifesting what you really want, and away from your authentic life. I am your host, Sarah, from Spirit, Mind, Body. Hello, everyone. Welcome back if you are joining me again. Welcome if you are new. I am so glad to have you here with me today. Today we're talking about, I want to say, like the parental shadow. There are things that happened, patterns in our childhood that I think that it's worthwhile to talk about. And I think that this might have the potential to be a heavy episode. So that's kind of a disclaimer. It was heavy for me to write it. I'll just say that. It was heavy for me to write it. It's heavy for me to articulate it. But on the other side of that heaviness is a liberation from that. We can't just keep pushing these things out of our awareness or out of our conscious thought and expect them to resolve themselves. They don't resolve themselves. We have to bring it to a surface. We have to have conversations about it. And we have to deal with it and be willing to feel it to the depths. And then through that feeling to the depths, we can emerge as a more empowered person who we were always meant to be. And so today I'm going to talk about a couple of maybe toxic parental patterns, for lack of a better term. They're parental patterns that I've seen in my work, that I've seen in people. And the purpose of me talking about this is first to let you know that you're not alone. And secondly, to let you know that there's this pull to think that our parents or the people who raised us were I just was listening to a podcast, and the person on it was saying that, it's impossible for a child to see their parent as anything less than perfect. And when we do see our parents as something less than perfect, we have this tendency to be, it's earth-shattering, and it's heartbreaking and devastating, and it's almost like we felt like we were living a lie. But through that feeling of discovering the reality of the situation, we can also have compassion, and there is a potential for us to grow through that and to grow up and out of that. And the purpose of me doing this episode and talking about these things is, yes, for one, to let you know that you're not alone, to let you know that there is no such thing as a perfect person, and to expose maybe how you're dealing with it right now. And is there a better way? Could you be dealing with it better? And so that's my intention for this episode. Yes, like I said, it has a chance to get heavy if you are in a place where maybe you're not ready to deal with that. If you're at work or something like that, maybe, you could save this episode for a little bit later. I just wanted to let you know that my intention is to make this a 2-part episode. So I'm going to talk about us and how we grew up and how the parental figures in our lives may still be haunting us. And then I'm talking about the next episode, which will be a bonus episode, is going to be all about how we as people can do it better for our own children, or for whatever children are in your life. If you're an aunt, an uncle, or even just you have friends whose children are in your lives, or if you're a teacher or somebody else, what can you do to stop these patterns to the best of your ability? So that's what we're going to talk about next time. This time we're talking all about how those toxic patterns may have left us damaged, and then what we can do to move through and out of that. So not everything in your life today is a result of your upbringing, but as I dive further down this spiritual healing rabbit hole, and the more I see others do it too, the more I realize that a lot of it is driven by our upbringing. A lot of it is driven by our unprocessed childhood traumas, things that we have refused to look at, things that we have not dealt with. And so this is a chance to rewrite your story. This is a chance to see things for what they are, and then to move through and to move out of that. Our histories shape our lenses probably more than we will ever realize. They shape our lens that we view the world through. They shape how we see situations. They shape how we interpret the motives of others. You're always viewing everything through a lens. What should I be doing? What did that person mean? What am I being called to do? That's all shaped by your lens. And so much of that lens is, some of it is positive, but then also there's so much of it that hurts. That lens is cracked, and maybe it's dirty, and that dirt, those cracks, those things are also where your wounds lie. That's maybe where you're not seeing things so clearly. And those wounds that you carry are generally because they were handed down to you. They were from your past, from your childhood. So this could be generational, like aging back to your parents and even your parents before that. And in fact, probably most of them are. So if you have a toxic parental pattern that your, mother gave to you, say your mom was not emotionally available for you, or say your dad taught you that you couldn't feel emotions, or that it was wrong to feel angry, or in your household there was this idea that if you didn't have control over your emotions, there was something wrong with you. And so you taught yourself to stifle it. What your parents were giving to you was what they probably learned from their parents. And they were probably taught you should not feel emotion. And then that goes back another generation, and that goes back another generation, right? And so when we talk about generational wounds, it's just because we haven't been conscious enough to deal with it. So much of the way in which our parents parented was just because they had learned that and they know no other way. Also, they could be products of your own parents' stress or overwhelmed, especially if you were raised by like a single parent, or if you come from a family that had constant financial stress, or the breadwinner in your family was always on the verge of getting laid off. Or say you were growing up in a time where the economy was shit. That was a constant looming thing that was always hanging over your head, that constant stress contributes to the way that your parent is able to show up for you. And so, I think I always say this, stress turns us into the worst versions of ourselves. We default to the person that we don't want to be. We default to our wounds. We hate feeling stressed, so we're constantly trying to move out of it. And usually that shows up as anger. Instead of feeling stressed, we'd rather feel anger because that makes us feel a little bit better, a little bit more in control, a little bit more powerful. But then we're spewing our anger onto our unwitting bystanders, aka our children. And so can you see how there's so much that's unconscious, that maybe your parent was probably trying to raise you in the best way possible, but that could have come out in the worst way. Does that make sense? So today we're going to talk about what these wounds looked like, how they manifested, and then how to stop passing those wounds onto innocent ones. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. So I wanted to start with 2 quotes that have been very, very helpful in me understanding this and how all these things work. And they've been really, really impactful in the way that I carry out my life, especially as a parent now myself. So the first is one that comes from Carl Jung, who said, "The greatest burden a child must carry is the unlived life of the parent." Can you see that in your own life? Can you see how the unlived life of your parent is now what you carry forward? Maybe that was them not pursuing a goal or a dream. Maybe that was not leaving a relationship that was damaging for the entire family. And now you carry that forward. The second quote, it comes from James Hollis. I can't remember what book it comes in, but he's a Jungian analyst. And he says, "Families are most often organized around the most damaged person. Often this is a parental figure." If you find that hitting home to you, or if you find that striking true in your heart, and certainly it did for me in so many ways, that is what this is why I'm talking about this, because whether we admit it or not, it's going to come up, and these things show up in our lives. And so that's a very difficult thing to talk about, but talking about it is how we move through it. I remember having a thought when I was young that my parents were sort of like gods. I remember looking up to parental figures. I remember looking up to teachers. I remember looking up to even religious leaders and thinking to myself that they had all the answers. They knew everything. They knew what was best for me. And I always assumed that they were something of a different species, and I never recognized their humanness until I became an adult myself. And then in life, as we all should, I hit a point where I did realize that my parents are actually just people. I realized that they were growing up as they were raising me. And like everyone, they have redeeming characteristics, but they also have their own faults. And I recognized that my parents were actually just growing up themselves as they were raising me and my siblings. And this is really the truth. I just want to tell you that there is no perfect person in the world. There's not one person that has all the answers. There is not one person that is most grown and evolved and that you can look at and that has figured it all out. Not a single one. And as a side note, don't we still do that though sometimes? Don't we still fall into that childhood idea that maybe there is somebody who has figured it out? This could show up as thinking that there's a perfect soulmate out there, and that soulmate is the person that's going to come save you. This could show up as giving that authority over to governments, systems, or doctors to fix it for you. Through my pregnancies, I don't see a doctor on the regular right now, but even, my kids do. And through my pregnancies, I was the person who was like, "Hey, did you look at this scientific article?" Because my health is in my own hands, and I recognize that. But for so many of us, we hand over that authority to somebody else. We say, "You know what is best for me." And really growing up is realizing that there is no person who has all the answers. Yes, somebody could have more formalized training than you. Yes, somebody could have a higher IQ than you. Yes, somebody could have more credentials than you. But do they have the capacity to know what's better for you than you do? I don't think so. And so I think that it's important to stop handing that over to somebody else where you should be taking control of that. And so either you've had this realization already that there's no perfect person, or you haven't. And it's been my experience, though, that coming to this realization actually with anyone is quite devastating. Wherever you see yourself or wherever you see someone else as having all the answers, and then all of a sudden that crumbles, that leaves you feeling very alone and isolated and lost, to be honest. This happened to me with my parents. This happened to me with systems, with health systems, when I realized that, maybe the health system didn't have all the answers, or it's geared to a specific agenda, and that agenda may or may not have my best interest in mind. This happened to me when I left organized religion, and when I realized that maybe Christianity wasn't the path for me, and that, maybe there were many paths to God. And every time that this happened, it's like this crumbling of this idea. It's this crumbling of what I had thought, this image that I held in such high regard. And I had to come to terms with the fact that I'm it. And that's maybe my message to you, is that you're it. There's nobody else. It's you. You have all the answers, but you have to trust yourself. And we desperately don't want to come to terms with this reality. We really don't. I think the same thing happens. This happens to an extent when famous people are convicted of heinous crimes. You guys remember the whole Bill Cosby thing? No one wanted to believe that this upstanding family man had this dark side in them. No one wants to believe that. And so when that happens, either you can stay in denial or you can come to terms with the fact. And when you come to terms with the fact that there's no perfect person, you have to come back to yourself. And then I think that's kind of the point of it. It's to recognize your own personal empowerment. The more you do that, the more you can walk your own path. So I thought that maybe I would take a little bit of time to do an overview of some toxic parental patterns that I have recognized. And this is not all inclusive. This is not anything from a textbook, right? This is just my own observations. Take it or leave it. And I say parental patterns, but really it could be any authority figure in your life. It could be an authority figure growing up. It could be an authority figure right now. And so just understand that I say parental, but it could be teachers. It could be religious leaders. It could be after school people, anybody that had authority in your life growing up or you look up to, have the potential to have these toxic patterns. And it's important to recognize them and call them out, because then you can, first off, that image starts to crumble. And as devastating as that is, you start to see the reality of the situation. And then furthermore, you stop passing that on to someone else. We got to call these things out. They can't just stay in the shadows forever. So the first one that I have is that you could have the overbearing or over-controlling parent or parental figure. And with this person being overbearing or over-controlling, you probably got these messages. First off, you got a message that you have to do or to be a certain person in order to make them happy. You got this message that if you were only to get the perfect grades, if you were to be the best sports player, or if you were to uphold this image of being the perfect child, or you were to be perfectly behaved according to them, or if you were able to manage your emotions perfectly, that's the overbearing, controlling parent. That's the message that you may have gotten. You could have gotten the message that the world is an overly judgmental place and you have to act and you have to put on your best face, that you can't show any kind of weakness. And from the parent's perspective or from the caregiver's perspective, this type of parent is highly focused on behavior, which leads to acting or pretending. When a parent or a parental figure is overbearing or overly controlling, what it leads to is children that are very good actors. And so maybe this manifests in your adult life as perfectionism. You are not able to cry. You may not be able to show your true self. You have to put on this perfect face and you can't let anybody see that you're just a human. in that, we stop connecting with people on this soul level. The truth is that our pain often connects us. The truth is that our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities are what binds us together. It's not our perfectionism. Our perfectionism, if anything, separates us. It's the things that make us raw, the things that make us human. And so if you constantly carry this face of perfectionism, you may have trouble in your adult life connecting with people on that level. You may have a hard time experiencing true and intimate relationships. I would say that also the overbearing parent leads to people who lie really well. They lie to themselves, they lie to other people. Anything that they do that maybe is not socially sanctioned is covered up in some way. And so in a lot of ways, this leads to us living a double life where we sort of split off pieces of our personality. We say, I'm this person over here, and I have this secret life that I can't let anybody see. That's a very difficult thing to deal with. And so the work there is to accept ourselves basically as we are. Okay, the next type of, I feel so judgmental saying toxic, but I've got to call it out, and words are clunky and imperfect, and so here we are. So the next type of toxic parental pattern is to be overly permissive. There's no rules, no boundaries, anything goes. Emotional security is provided, but not necessarily by the parent, but maybe a surrogate source that we're encouraged maybe by the parent, or maybe just by the lack of parental guidance. In this pattern, and I'm not saying always, this is just a pattern. This is the way that it manifests a lot. If there's an overly permissive parent or parental figure, sometimes it looks like you can have whatever you want, just don't cry. It's the parent that's bending over to cater to the child without rules or enforcement. And a lot of times that shows up as like, you can eat whatever you want, or you can have whatever you want, whatever toy you want. And so a lot of times that leads to, maybe in your adult life, that can lead to you being a little lost. That could lead to you being a little misguided in what really life is about. If it's overly permissive, if you grew up in a house that was overly permissive, perhaps you never learned to work for something. Perhaps you never saw the fruits of your labor as everything was handed to you. And what I would say is that is probably the most rewarding thing in life is to work through something that was hard, to do hard things, to face yourself against challenges and to overcome those challenges and to find out really what you're made of. But if you've never had those challenges in life, if you never have had that taste of I could do something hard and then I can also emerge victorious over that hard thing. If you've never had that taste, then when you see challenges in your adult life, it becomes very difficult for you to face those challenges and have faith that they're worth going through. Does that make sense? And so your work here, if you identify with this parental pattern, if you identify with being raised in a household that was sort of like this, maybe your work is to start doing hard things. Every day, could you just do something that makes you a little uncomfortable? Could you see the efforts of what was hard? And could you find a way to emerge from that? And then once that happens, once you see what's on the other side of that, then that starts to snowball. Okay, the third toxic parental pattern is that you may have been raised in a household where the parent was a little manipulative, where the child is sort of forced to serve the parent's agenda in some way. And by the way, none of these are judgments and none of these are hard and fast rules. I feel like I just have to overemphasize this point that this is just a pattern and it's not my judgment. And a lot of these things are very, very unconscious. And so to get back to it though, when this manipulative type of parental pattern, I think often shows up as you think you're doing the right thing by telling your kid, please don't do that because that makes mommy sad. The point to this is that your child, you are the adult. And if you flip this, the parent that raised you was the adult. And if you were the child in that situation, that's sending a message to you as a child that you are responsible for this adult emotion, which, by the way, if it depends on the age of the child, but through your upbringing and through your development, emotions are not something that are easily managed by children. That's why 2-year-olds have temper tantrums. And it's up to the parent to coach that child through their emotions. It's up to the parent to help them deal with their emotions and to help them make sense of them and to know what to do with that, energy that's moving through them at the speed of light, or that overwhelming sense of emotion that's bubbling over and through them. It's up to the parent to teach them how to do that. So when that phrase, "Don't do that because that makes mommy sad," or "You're making me feel that way," when the child is then responsible not only for their own emotions, they're also responsible for their parents' emotions, which I think is pretty unfair to the child. They are not equipped with the actual biological machinery to be able to deal with that. And then they're also being held responsible for an adult who is equipped with that. Does that make sense? I've seen this being said. I've seen this manipulation kind of in the way I have heard a 4-year-old be told by his mom that when you're older, you're not going to love me anymore. Can you see how damaging that could be to a 4-year-old? Because the 4-year-old genuinely believes everything that the parent says. You have to view this through the eyes of the child. Through the child's eyes, the parent is a god. They basically don't have any faults and they know everything. And so when you get this message as a child, you believe everything they say. And so that leads to almost a complex growing older. This manipulative parenting style also forces the child to be the adult in the parent-child relationship. And what I have seen, the pattern that I have seen, is that oftentimes the child of the manipulative parent will go off and will try to then have the savior complex, and then in their adult relationships will not be able to form this emotional intimacy with somebody new because they're worried about having to save them just like they saved their parent. It's a repeat pattern. And so the work here is to recognize that your healing, if you were raised in this type of household, your work is to realize that you are not responsible for the things that you were believed to be responsible for. You have to let yourself off the hook for somebody else's emotions. You probably are going to have to work on setting boundaries. You're probably going to have to work on not absorbing the emotions of somebody else as your responsibility and coming back home to yourself and saying that the only person you're responsible for is yourself. Again, this is not perfect. This doesn't happen every single time, but this is just patterns that, have shown up over and over and over again. And I want to say there's a good book. If this is something that you identify with, there's a good book called Silently Seduced by Kenneth Adams. And if you're looking for a little bit more support in that area, that might be a good one for you to check out. Okay, the fourth one, and by the way, all of these I think kind of merge together. They're really not 100% cut and dry. They're not, if you had an overbearing parent, you may also have had another parent that was overly permissive. If you had an overbearing parent, maybe that one was also manipulative in some way. And so there's a lot of bleed over, and these are not cut and dry categories. You're trying to fit yourself okay, I definitely fall into this category, and then, no other apply. They mesh together, they bleed together. And again, most of these parental patterns are generational. They don't even, your parents probably didn't even realize they were doing this. And even if you are a parent, you could maybe see something of these in yourself and how you parent. And the best you can do is apologize or come to terms with, what you didn't know, and then do your best going forward. Okay, the fourth one that I have is emotional neglect. So when I read about parenting, I realize now that the importance of being emotionally attuned to your child is very, very important. To validate that I see you're feeling frustrated, to say, I understand that you're really angry and here are the boundaries. Here's what we're not allowed to do. We can't hurt other people, but I also validate that you're angry. I also have felt angry. Validating that. I think a lot of us, especially if you were raised in the 90s or the 80s, we didn't know a lot about this. This was not common. I don't think that this was common knowledge among our parents. So it's really important that we be very kind to them and that we understand that our parents were probably doing the best that they were doing at the time. And so if your parent was not emotionally attuned to you, maybe it's because, first off, they were not emotionally attuned to themselves. Maybe they were a child of a parent that was not emotionally attuned to them. And so it's important to understand that most of this stuff is not intentional. So in this case, if your parents were emotionally neglectful, maybe you were taught, don't feel, buck up, stop crying, don't feel anger. You're not allowed to feel that way. You get this message that you're not allowed to feel certain emotions because they're negative, or because maybe your parent thought, if I feel angry, that makes me feel out of control. And so that then becomes a projection on the child, where they say, if you're going to get angry, that means that you're not going to be in control. And so that makes me feel uncomfortable. And so then you're just not allowed to get angry at that point. And so it's really important, though, for healthy childhood emotional development to understand that, our parents are emotionally attuned to us. Our parents understand what it's like to be frustrated or angry or some of these more difficult emotions to deal with. And if you didn't have that kind of support, maybe that could lead to a lot of numbing in your adult life. I think that this was probably in part my journey. A lot of the times for a long time, and I even still kind of struggle with it, I have to remind myself to feel a lot. And I don't think that this is a natural thing. I don't think this is the way that we were supposed to be. I think that feeling is a natural product of being a human. And so when we cut ourselves off from feeling, we start to live this numb life where we turn to probably surrogate sources for comfort, meaning like food, alcohol, screens, TV, social media, shopping, anything that is out beyond one-on-one personal relationships or even group relationships that make us feel a little bit more comfortable. I think that can happen a lot. And also, I think that it leads to us holding a lot of trauma and a lot of emotional situations in our body and not being able to work past that. I would say, though, that altogether, even if you did grow up in a very healthy environment where you're like, my parents really didn't do any of that stuff, chances are high that you got some sort of message that we're not seen, that we're not important, that your emotions or your inner world is not important, and that love needs to be earned by you, and that by cramming yourself into some kind of mold, by putting on a face or a mask and pretending to be somebody that you're not. I think almost everyone goes through this. Even if you think that your upbringing was great, your parents were absolutely wonderful and supportive, maybe you saw these patterns in your peer relationships. Maybe you got it from a teacher. Maybe you got it from another caregiver. And the work in this life is to figure out who we really are. For some reason, the process to do that is to first figure out who we aren't. And we all have masks. We all have been playing pretend probably for a very long time. And it takes courage to take off these masks and to become who our souls are calling us to be. But we have to realize, we have to come to terms with the person that we aren't first. So I wanted to be talking about how are we dealing with these masks today. And I want to bring this to light so that we can kind of see it, touch it, feel it, see where we are. And again, it's not cut and dry. You can be in many of these categories. I sort of just broke it up into the way that made sense to me, but it's not so cut and dry. It can be a lot of different categories. So first off, you might be still in service to an agenda that your parents have. If you find yourself doing these things, You may not have had the awakening that your parents are just people. And so in this way, I would say that archetypally, we're still sort of in a child type mindset. So maybe this is choosing the profession that your parents had approved of. And I just want to make it clear, just because you choose a profession that your parents have approved of, say like you come from a long line of doctors and you chose the doctor profession, that might be a soul calling to you. But if you're unhappy as a doctor, you need to ask yourself, am I still in service to this agenda that my parents had for me that is no longer fitting? And this might not even be because your parents overtly said it. It might be because you just sort of assumed. I think that this happened with me. My parents are both in the medical profession. I chose to pursue science because I thought that that fell in line. I'd say that my soul calling is probably more, what I'm doing right now on the coaching self-development side. But my parents never told me that it was an expectation to be in the medical profession or a scientist or anything like that. They never told me that I had to pursue biochemistry. They never told me that this was the expectation. I just sort of picked it up. I just saw it and I thought, this is how to be successful. This is how I would gain my parents' approval. And so it doesn't always have to be overt. That's kind of why I say that. So the other way that this might show up is maybe it's choosing a lover or a relationship that your parents approved of, or having great relationships fall apart because your partner didn't meet the mold of what your parents had approved of. Or if this goes really deep, maybe your parents don't have to say that out loud, but you are unconsciously judging or secretly tearing your partner apart, comparing them to what you think your parents would want. You're never going to let your partner measure up because you're secretly nitpicking every little thing apart about them because you so desperately want your partner to fit that mold of what your parent thinks that your partner should be. Does that make sense? Another way that this can show up is not saying certain things around your parents or walking on eggshells around them because you don't want them to judge them or think down or think anything less of you. You're constantly in service to that agenda that your parents had. Maybe that means that you're fighting for a cause that's not actually yours, but is your parents', and your heart isn't in it now, but you don't know how to leave. Maybe your parent was really passionate about this one thing, and so you are following in their footsteps, but your heart just isn't in it. It could be a family business, or it could be just a cause. It could be a political agenda. Who knows? Maybe it's returning to your parents for things, resources, money, etc., when you as an adult really should be providing for yourself. As long as you need something from someone, long as you need something from your parent, even from your partner now, you're more susceptible. If you're not self-sufficient, you're more susceptible to fitting that mold of who you want them to be, to selling your soul to keep the peace with them so that you can keep getting the resources that you need from them. You might think that you're getting something for free, but actually you're paying them by being the person that they need you to be rather than the person that you are. This is why I really advocate for self-sufficiency, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. It doesn't necessarily need to look like owning your own house, but certainly being financially independent is one of those ways. And there's so many different ways to be financially independent. You don't need to make 6 figures a year to support yourself, but you do need to figure out what's important to you so that you can live within your means. Does that make sense? Okay. The second way that you could be wearing these masks now is by carrying out the opposite to that agenda. This is sort of like having a rebellious teenager mindset. This is the sentiment that my parents messed it up so badly that I will never be like them. And in fact, I'm just going to be the opposite of them. What I have to say for you is that you are still in service to their agenda. You're still imprisoned by their agenda. You're not free. If you're carrying out the opposite to what your parents are, and you're doing it because you're never going to be like them, then, and there's like some kind of hatred in your heart, you're still bound to doing that. And you are stopping yourself from growing into the person that you're meant to be because you're bound to this opposite agenda. Does that make sense? You're still putting a cap on yourself. So for instance, maybe that's your parent was never there for you. You resolve you're always going to be there for your kids. You're always going to be present. And so you give up what your soul is really calling you to do in order to be a stay-at-home mom. Or maybe it's the opposite of that. Maybe your parents were there for you and you were like, no, I think that it's really important to pursue my career. And so I'm going to pursue my career even though your soul is calling you to be a stay-at-home mom. There's so many different ways this plays out and it's just specific to you. The point is that you need to ask yourself, what do you really want to be doing? And if you're not doing that, and if you're doing something because you're trying to be that rebellious teenager against or do the exact opposite that your parents did, you're still not doing what you really want to be doing. This could also look like choosing a partner or choosing a profession that fixes people that were just like your parents. In doing so, you think you're sort of unconsciously, you're making somebody else fit the role of your parent and like you're trying to do what you couldn't do in the past. The point here, though, is like you have to ask yourself, is this really what you want to be doing? If it is, then go for it. If this is your soul calling, don't stop yourself. But if you're doing it because, and this is why the why is so important, but if you're doing it because you are trying to, do the exact opposite, and that's not really what you want to be doing, then you're still bound to what your parents, that still has a hold on you. That's still keeping you imprisoned. The other way, the final way that I have, the way that this can show up, if this is still haunting you, if these toxic parental patterns have followed you and it's still sticking with you and it's haunting you, is that maybe you're numbing or self-soothing because we've just settled into that acceptance that this is all there is. Not a spiritual, soulful acceptance of reality and doing our best going forward. It's like the acceptance that kind of applies our history to all of our tomorrows. And we say, okay, well, this is all there is. And we stop ourselves from growing. In this case, we could be, numbing ourselves with TV, with sex, with alcohol or other drugs. We could be numbing ourselves even with caffeine or hyperproductivity or an addiction to the gym or health addiction, like we're addicted to being healthy or whatever it is. Whatever, if you're using anything, it could look really healthy on the outside, but even if you're using running as a means of escape, or if you're using anything as a means of escape, what are you avoiding? And then what you're avoiding is part of your shadow. Whatever you're avoiding is going to continue to crop up in very unexpected areas of your life. And so that's why it's really important. Whatever you're using as numbing, even if it is a healthy thing, you have to look at it and say, okay, well, what am I afraid of facing by using this thing to stop myself from facing it? And when you can see what you've been afraid to face, then you can heal it and move through it. Okay. I will just leave you with this. I think that anger is a very natural reaction. This is where I went a lot of times. It's very easy to learn something new and say, well, somebody else should have known that. They should have done this. They should have, been better. And while we have this tendency, it's incredibly important to understand that carrying anger through and with you nowadays, first off, it's probably based on something that is not true. Your parents may not have had the ability to, they may not have had the ability to be the parent that you really needed, and they may not have had the information that we have nowadays, right? So it's really important to have a wider perspective of this. I cannot emphasize this enough. Also understand that I think that we all tell ourselves that growing up, we deserve unconditional love, and that unconditional love should come from our parents. And this may be controversial, but I don't believe that. I think that unconditional love comes from the universe and from your soul, and it does exist, but I don't know that you're going to get it from your parent. I do believe that people can only love you as deeply as they have loved themselves. I think that whatever you have unhealed in yourself, you have this unconscious tendency to project it onto somebody else, to say that's wrong or that's not okay. This is why doing the work on yourself is so important, especially if you are a parent or you are influencing children's lives in any way. It's really important to work on yourself and to start to love yourself unconditionally first, because Otherwise, unconsciously, the tendency is to put that on somebody else and to judge them. And so wherever your parents fall short of loving themselves is probably where they're going to also fall short of loving you. And I don't think that that's a fault that they have. I think that's just a natural human tendency. You have to realize that unconditional love exists, but it exists in the spiritual sense, and it exists within you. And unconditional love can start with you, but you have to turn it inwards and you have to stop expecting it from other people. To expect it from other people is to put conditions on them, and that's not loving them unconditionally either, right? Does that make sense? If I say that I needed you to love me unconditionally and you didn't, then I'm putting conditions on my love for them, aren't I? And in that case, aren't I cutting myself off from what the unconditional love that I do deserve? You know, the love that I should be giving myself and the love that I could be giving out to other people. So it's just important to keep that in mind. You know, if you find yourself in a really negative space, could you allow yourself to feel and go there, but then eventually also rise out of it? It's important to not, like, whatever is arising, allow it to, you know, feel and work its way through you. And then, like, we have to let it go. We have to move through it. We have to start to focus inward and start to look at our own journey and move in and through and out of it. Next time, I'm going to talk about what can we do if you are a parent or you are some kind of caregiver in any way. If you have nieces or nephews or children of friends that you hang out with, if you're influencing any kind of child's life, it's really important that, like, you are also doing your work so that you don't accidentally pass this on. You're probably going to pass it on. It is what it is. That's just the way that life goes. But can we do a little bit of damage mitigation as much as possible? That's really the thing. And then it's not just for them. It's really for you. The more you heal for yourself, the better you become. And the better you become unconsciously, right? The more you heal, your default state is going to elevate every single time. So, okay, I know that was kind of a heavy episode. I am not sorry. Sorry, not sorry. We have to talk about these things. We have to be willing to have hard conversations. And it's a little painful when we go there, but that is also ultimately our liberation. So thank you guys for hanging with me today. I will see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, I would invite you to subscribe, share it with someone you know, and leave an honest rating or review. You can also connect with me through Instagram at spiritmind.body, through YouTube, or my website. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes below. This work is not easy and requires tremendous self-reflection, grit, and a willingness to be misunderstood, and for that, I honor every single one of you for showing up for your authentic self. Until next time.